Welcome back to the Unseen Wisdom. I'm really glad we're getting to continue our deep dives into the reactions to President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address. Last time we unpacked NSHAW's perspective. And today we're going to sort of broaden that lens a little bit and see how other voices are responding to the president's vision.
Yeah, what strikes me as I look at these different reactions is this real undercurrent of skepticism. It's not just disagreement with specific policies, but a deeper sense of we've heard this all before.
That really echoes what we were seeing from NEWU, didn't it? It wasn't just the content of the proposals, but this feeling that the government's track record makes it hard to take them seriously.
Exactly, and you see this even more sharply with someone like Papa Penny, the musician and MP. He straight up called the speech misleading and very pointedly highlighted the lack of progress on really basic needs: poverty, crime, access to water, all these issues that have persisted despite years of promises.
It's like he's saying, we're tired of the same song, Mr. President. Show us some new moves.
Right, it's not enough to talk anymore. People want to see action. And you hear that same demand from opposition party leaders, too. They're not just offering alternatives, they're questioning the feasibility of the president's economic goals in the first place.
Yeah.
Especially that over 3% GDP growth target. They point to the existing economic struggles and the track record to say, look, where's the evidence? This time will be different.
So it's a call for accountability, really, moving beyond the words to demonstrable plans. Do you think this skepticism is also impacting how people view the Government of National Unity, the GNU?
Oh, absolutely. The GNU was supposed to be this symbol of unity and collaborative governance. But even within the GNU, you're seeing people question whether it's working. Like Dr. Mulder from the Freedom Front Plus, he actually expressed disappointment that the SONA didn't strongly emphasize unity or really articulate a shared vision.
That's pretty significant, isn't it? A member of the GNU itself saying it's not living up to its promise. What specifically is Dr. Mulder concerned about?
Well, he brought up international relations as an example. He feels that area is still being dominated by the ANC, and that contradicts the spirit of a truly unified government.
So even within this alliance, there are worries about whether they're really on the same page, especially on critical issues like foreign policy.
Yeah, and that lack of clear alignment within the GNU itself just feeds right back into that public distress we were talking about. If the government isn't united, how can they expect to tackle these complex challenges facing the country?
Let's dig into those international relations a bit deeper. The president's stance, particularly regarding the United States, has gotten some really mixed reactions.
It has, hasn't it? His statement that South Africa won't be bullied was applauded by some, but it also raised concerns for others, especially given South Africa's position within the BRICS group.
So there's this tightrope to walk between asserting independence and also maintaining these crucial international partnerships.
And that's where Dr. Mulder's perspective comes back in. He's advocating for a more pragmatic approach, one that prioritizes South Africa's own national interests above all else, and builds beneficial relationships with all nations, not just picking sides.
So less ideology, more practicality.
Exactly. Now, whether that's what the president's actually doing is up for debate. But his plan to send a delegation to the U.S. to explain South Africa's position at least suggests an attempt at open communication.
You think that'll be enough to calm the waters, though? Especially after all the recent tension around the Lady R incident and the U.S. accusations, that whole situation really put a spotlight on how complicated South Africa's international relationships are.
Oh, without a doubt. And it definitely added fuel to this debate about which direction South Africa's foreign policy is headed.
And this brings us right back to that trust issue, doesn't it? The lack of clarity, the perceived inconsistencies in foreign policy, it all just feeds into that skepticism we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. It's like a domino effect. The public is already questioning the government's ability to handle domestic issues, and now this uncertainty on the international stage just amplifies those concerns.
And speaking of complex international situations, the deployment of South African troops to the Democratic Republic of Congo is another point that's sparking a lot of debate.
The DRC conflict is a tough one, no easy answers there. And the president's remarks about South Africa's role in it have definitely generated a whole spectrum of reactions.
What are some of the key concerns that you're seeing?
Well, transparency is a big one. Some people question the mission's true objective, and there's concern about the lack of clear communication from the government about the goals, the funding, the exit strategy.
It's understandable, isn't it? This conflict has been dragging on for so long and cost countless lives. People want to know their troops are being deployed for the right reasons.
Exactly. And then there's the question of effectiveness as well. Wanda Mai, the leader of the United Africans for Transformation, he's actually arguing for a more diplomatic approach. He questions the value of South Africa's continued military involvement and advocates for prioritizing peace negotiations instead.
So he's essentially saying South Africa might be prolonging the conflict rather than helping to resolve it.
That's his argument, yeah. And this viewpoint is gaining more traction with these recent reports of the DRC army fleeing certain areas. It's adding to the confusion about what the mission's future is.
So the question becomes, what role are South African troops expected to play now? Are they supposed to fill the void left by the retreating DRC forces? This lack of clear communication from the government is definitely worrying.
It is. It creates this vacuum where speculation and fear can take root. People deserve to know what's happening, what the plan is, especially when the lives of their loved ones are at stake.
And this lack of transparency just further erodes trust in the government's handling of the situation.
Without a doubt, it feeds right back into that broader narrative of skepticism we've been talking about.
Okay, let's move on to another crucial issue that the president addressed, which is corruption. His announcements about new measures to combat this, including a new forensic center and strengthened whistleblower protections, those were met with kind of a mixed bag of hope and reservation, weren't they?
It's that cautious optimism again, isn't it? People want to believe these measures will make a difference. But there's also that weariness of, we've heard this before.
Like a glimmer of light, but is it the way out of the tunnel?
Exactly. And you see this in how opposition leaders are responding. They question whether these measures are enough to really tackle the deeply rooted corruption within the government. They're calling for more concrete steps. Increased funding for investigative bodies, specialized courts to speed up prosecutions.
The idea of specialized courts is interesting. It speaks to the frustration with how slow the justice system can be.
Exactly. It often feels like justice delayed is justice denied. So there's this desire for a more streamlined process, one that can hold those who are guilty accountable quickly and effectively.
That would certainly send a strong signal that the government is serious. But, as always, it comes down to implementation and political will. Will these announcements actually turn into tangible action?
That's the million-dollar question. Actions speak louder than words, especially when it comes to fighting corruption. The public is watching and waiting to see if these promises translate into real, meaningful change. You know, it's really interesting how the president tried to balance everything in this speech. He acknowledged the very real problems that South Africa is facing, but he also tried to project this sense of optimism for the future.
Right, it's a classic move for a politician, isn't it? Acknowledge the struggles but offer hope, a vision of a brighter tomorrow.
Exactly. But the thing is, sometimes it feels like that optimism can overshadow the reality on the ground.
Like people are struggling to put food on the table. And they're being told to just focus on this distant horizon.
Yeah. Right. And that disconnect is exactly what fuels that skepticism we were talking about earlier. You can lay out these grand visions and ambitious plans, but if people's daily lives aren't improving, those words start to ring hollow.
It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. No matter how beautiful the house is, it's not going to last.
That's a good analogy. And one of the cornerstones of any stable society is a healthy economy. So the president's emphasis on job creation was definitely crucial, especially considering South Africa's unemployment rate.
Absolutely. People need jobs, they need opportunities, they need to be able to provide for their families.
Right, and without that, it's hard to imagine any real progress happening. But this is where some of the critiques come in. People argue that the president's proposals were too vague, that they lacked specifics, that they were more about aspirations than concrete strategies.
So it's like, okay, we need jobs, but how are we going to create them?
Exactly. People want to know which sectors will be prioritized, how the government will address those deeper structural issues that lead to unemployment.
It's not just about the number of jobs, right? It's about the quality of those jobs, whether those jobs can actually lift people out of poverty.
Absolutely. It's about creating a more equitable society. And that's why the president's focus on supporting small businesses and entrepreneurship is interesting. But again, the question is, how will this be implemented? How will the government actually provide the resources, the training, the access to markets that these businesses need to succeed?
It has to be more than just talk. It has to be about creating an environment where those businesses can actually flourish.
I agree. And that brings us to another critical piece of the puzzle: education. The reactions to the president's comments on education were really interesting. I think it reflects how complex this issue is.
Yeah, education is often seen as this key to unlocking potential. But the system in South Africa faces so many challenges.
Exactly. The president talked a lot about skill development and vocational training, and that got some mixed reactions.
Some people probably like that focus on practical skills, preparing people for the workforce.
Right, but others worried that it might come at the expense of a more well-rounded education.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it? Preparing people for jobs, but also nurturing those critical thinking skills, creativity, adaptability.
Right, because the world is changing so rapidly. And then there's the issue of inequality within the education system itself. The gap between schools in wealthy areas and those in disadvantaged communities is still huge.
It's like we're asking some kids to run a race with weights strapped to their ankles.
That's a powerful image, and that's why you hear these calls for increased investment in education. We need to ensure that all learners have access to quality education, no matter their background or where they live.
It's about creating a system that empowers, not one that holds people back.
I agree. And that requires a comprehensive approach, addressing infrastructure, teacher training, resources.
Well, and speaking of teachers, we can't forget the vital role they play.
Absolutely, and yet they often face incredibly challenging working conditions.
Overcrowded classrooms, lack of resources, it's a demanding job.
It is, and we need to make sure teachers are supported, not just with decent salaries, but with professional development opportunities, mentorship, a supportive work environment.
Investing in teachers is investing in the future.
Couldn't agree more. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about land reform. This is a topic that always evokes strong emotions and different viewpoints.
It's deeply intertwined with South Africa's history and identity.
Exactly. The president's remarks on land reform were met with, you guessed it, cautious optimism.
People want to believe that progress will be made.
But there's also this concern about how it will be done, the potential for corruption, mismanagement, even violence if it's not handled carefully.
Land ownership in South Africa is about so much more than just economics.
It's about dignity, belonging, healing the wounds of the past.
Absolutely.
But the challenge is how to implement land reform in a way that's just and equitable and sustainable.
It's about finding a solution that benefits everyone, that promotes reconciliation and shared prosperity.
I agree, but it's a complex issue. You have some people advocating for expropriation without compensation, and others who support a market-based approach.
It's a debate that goes to the heart of what kind of country South Africa wants to be.
And it requires careful thought, open dialogue, a real commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone. Now, shifting gears again, let's talk about climate change. The president emphasized the urgency of this issue and South Africa's commitment to transitioning to a green economy.
Yeah, the impacts of climate change are being felt everywhere.
Droughts, floods, the challenges are only going to intensify.
And they're not just environmental challenges, they have huge social and economic implications.
Exactly. So the president's focus on renewable energy and reducing carbon emissions is definitely positive.
It's about moving away from reliance on fossil fuels and creating a more sustainable future.
But it's a long road ahead. There are concerns about the potential job losses in the coal industry, about the affordability of renewable energy.
It's about making sure that this transition is a just transition, so that no one is left behind as South Africa moves toward a greener economy.
It's crucial. And it's not just about domestic action. Climate change requires international collaboration.
Sharing knowledge, supporting each other's efforts.
Working together to create a more sustainable future for everyone.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this segment. Job creation, education, land reform, climate change.
And through it all, that same thread keeps appearing. The need for action, accountability, and rebuilding trust.
The people of South Africa are demanding more from their leaders.
They are, and rightfully so.
They want to see tangible results, a real commitment to tackling these challenges.
The future of South Africa depends on it. It's interesting, isn't it? The whole world is watching what's happening in South Africa.
I guess because South Africa plays such a big role, not just on the continent, but globally. Their choices really have an impact far beyond their own borders.
It's a major player on the world stage, and the international community is definitely taking note of what's happening there.
So everything the president says and does is being analyzed by leaders all around the world.
Oh yeah, from his stance on international relations to his efforts to mediate conflicts in other countries, it all sends a message about where South Africa stands.
And it's not just the words, but the actions too.
Exactly.
Like his commitment to multilateralism, working with other nations.
Right, and those recent controversies definitely haven't made things any easier.
No, not at all. The Lady R situation, the accusations from the U.S., those have put South Africa in a really tough spot.
They have. It's strained relationships with key allies and raised a lot of questions about South Africa's neutrality in global conflicts.
Definitely a delicate situation. How do you see these events impacting South Africa's standing in the world?
Well, there's a perception challenge for sure. The president sending a delegation to the U.S. is being interpreted in different ways. Some people think it's a necessary step to try and smooth things over, but others see it as a sign of weakness, bowing to pressure.
I see what you mean. It's a tough balancing act. You don't want to seem weak on the world stage, but you also don't want to escalate tensions with powerful countries.
Exactly.
So strategically, what's the best move in this situation?
Well, it really depends on what South Africa's goals are. If the main objective is to de-escalate the situation with the U.S. and reassure them that everything's okay, then sending a delegation could be a good start. But it needs to be followed up with concrete actions.
Actions that address those concerns head on.
Right, because the world is watching to see if South Africa's actions will match its words. And not just the U.S., other nations are paying attention too.
Because it's about credibility on the world stage.
Exactly.
And we can't forget about the economic side of things either. South Africa does a lot of trade with Western countries. And if those relationships get damaged, it could really hurt their economy.
You're absolutely right. This whole situation highlights how interconnected things are. Foreign policy and economic policy, they're not separate. What happens on the global stage can have a direct impact on people's everyday lives.
Okay, so let's talk about another group that's been in the news a lot. BRICS. The president's comments about that group also got a lot of attention internationally.
Yeah, BRICS is a pretty big deal. It represents a real shift in the global balance of power.
Because it's not just about economics, is it?
No, it's about these emerging economies challenging the existing world order.
And South Africa, being a member of BRICS, presents both opportunities and challenges, right?
Absolutely. On the one hand, it opens doors to new markets, new investments, but on the other hand, it raises questions about aligning with certain countries, like Russia and China, who have been criticized for their human rights records and their style of government.
So it's like a balancing act. South Africa wants to be part of this new economic bloc, but it also doesn't want to compromise its own values.
Exactly.
And it doesn't want to alienate its traditional partners either.
Right, so the president is trying to navigate all of that, to reassure everyone that South Africa is making its own choices and pursuing its own interests.
He's threading a very delicate needle.
He is.
Trying to balance all these different priorities and figure out a way forward that works best for South Africa.
It's fascinating, isn't it? South Africa has such a unique history, so many possibilities ahead of it, and the whole world is watching to see what happens next.
Well, that's a great place to wrap things up for today. We've really gone deep into these reactions to President Ramaphosa's SONA.
We have, haven't we?
From the skepticism we heard at the beginning, to the hopes for a brighter future, and all the complex challenges in between.
We've talked about domestic issues, foreign policy, the economy, the environment.
And it all really highlights what a pivotal moment this is for South Africa.
It really does. The decisions they make now will shape their future for years to come.
And that's why we're here at the Unseen Wisdom, to help you make sense of these complex issues, to give you the insights and perspectives you need to understand what's happening in the world.
And we hope you'll keep joining us on this journey of discovery.
So until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep searching for those unseen connections that bind us all.
There's always more to learn, more to explore, and we'll be here to guide you along the way.